does it have to be that way? We can wave a wand and move beyond the ancient endless cycle that has proved a dismal failure.
Hello, and welcome to World Citizen Wire. I'm your host, Abel Tomlinson, broadcasting from Fayetteville, Arkansas. Our guest today is a national leader of the peace activism, David Swanson. David Swanson is not only an activist, but also an author, journalist, and radio host. He holds a master's degree in philosophy from the University of Virginia, and he's also the director of World Beyond War, a global nonviolent movement to end war and establish a just and sustainable peace. He's also the campaign coordinator for rootsaction.org and the 2015, 2016, and 2017 Nobel Peace Prize nominee. Swanson is the author of numerous books on war and peace, including War is a Lie, which is a catalog of numerous types of falsehoods regularly told about wars and how we can learn to resist future lies. He also wrote War is Never Just, which is a refutation of the just war theory. He also wrote War No More, The Case for Abolition, and also When the World Outlawed War, which is an account of the 1920s peace movement and the creation of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which outlawed war. And also he wrote a book called Daybreak, Undoing the Imperial Presidency and Forming a More Perfect Union. And most recently he wrote a book, co-authored a book called Global Security System, An Alternative to War, which is a vision of a world of nonviolent institutions. He also blogs at davidswanson.org and warisacrime.org, and he hosts a weekly radio show called Talk Nation Radio, which is on our local community radio station, KPSQ 97.3 FM. He speaks frequently on the topics of war and peace and engages in all kinds of nonviolent activism. Most recently, he drafted a resolution urging Congress to move money away from the military to human and environmental needs, rather than the reverse. Versions of this resolution were passed by several cities and by the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And now I want to play a couple clips of David's work. The first one is a short TED Talk that Swanson gave on why we should end war.
Every person outside of Charlottesville that I've asked has had no idea that the reason a statue of Robert E. Lee is still standing in this city, albeit covered in black plastic, is because a Virginia law bans the removal of war monuments. And I've never met anyone who has even considered banning the removal of peace monuments. The hardest part would be finding a peace monument to remove. If we removed only the racist war monuments in Charlottesville, we would lose Lee, Jackson, the generic Confederate, the people who helped slaughter Native Americans, the memorial to the war that killed some 3.8 million Vietnamese, although Vietnamese was not always the term used to refer to them, and the UVA monument to World War I, a war explicitly marketed as a war against the evil race of Huns. In other words, we would lose all the war monuments. I want to propose something harder, that we rid ourselves of war. The American Public Health Association calls militarism a public health threat. Gallup polling finds majorities around the world say the United States government is the top threat to peace on earth. Why? Well, the US spends about $1 trillion a year preparing for and fighting wars. 3% of that could end starvation. 1% could end the lack of clean drinking water. A bigger fraction could give us a chance against climate change. War kills, and it kills even more through the creation of famines and disease epidemics in places like Yemen, and most of all, through the diversion of resources from where they're needed. Totally destroy North Korea, totally restore Puerto Rico. It's our choice. War's victims are mostly civilians. War generates enemies. Terrorism has predictably increased throughout the war on terrorism. Militarism is a top destroyer of the natural environment. It reduces jobs. It fuels a culture of violence. It erodes our civil liberties. It militarizes our police. It gives Charlottesville a mine-resistant vehicle. Raise your hand if you have never stepped on a landmine in Charlottesville. War is not needed. Its presence is sporadic through history, virtually absent from prehistory, and unrecognizable in its current form from just a few centuries back. Intense conditioning is required. Higher suicide rates result, and not a single case has yet been found of PTSD from war deprivation. Since World War II, the United States has bombed over 30 countries, killed or helped kill some 20 million people. The U.S. provides training or weapons to 3/4 of the world's dictatorships. Many wars now have U.S. weapons on both sides. We know we have a racism problem. Do we realize that we have a militarism problem too? Maybe we would if we had any monuments to anything else. What about a monument in Charlottesville to civil rights? How about one for labor, one for women's rights, one for the environment, one for education, one for art, one for music? How about a monument to our sister cities? How about a monument in Charlottesville to peace?
David was also a leader in the national Bush impeachment movement, of which I was also a part. He was also a co-founder and coordinator of After Downing Street, which is a coalition of organizations that forced the Downing Street memo and other evidence into the media and sought accountability for the fraudulent marketing of the war on Iraq. And the Downing Street memos essentially proved that the administration was lying to the American public in order to justify war. And here now is a Fox News interview of David Swanson while he was working on that movement.
Protesters urged Americans to support resolutions of impeachment for President Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney. And we're joined now by Impeachment Day organizer David Swanson and the former New York Congresswoman that led the impeachment against President Richard Nixon, Elizabeth Holtzman. Welcome you both. Congresswoman Holtzman, welcome back. It's been a while since you've been on the show.
But it's great to see you both.
You know, not that he doesn't deserve it. Strategically, I don't think it's a good move for Democrats to spend the next 2 years, now that they've assumed power, impeaching President Bush, trying to get him out of office. Don't Democrats need to come up with a vision for the future that's there, that they own?
Well, I think the Congress can do two things. First of all, let me say when Nixon was impeached by the House Judiciary Committee, when the committee voted to impeach him, before the committee voted, impeachment wasn't on anyone's agenda, really. It was the American people who said this needed to be done. You can't be an agenda of politicians. Impeachment has to win support from the people. It can't just be Democrats doing it. It's got to be bipartisan.
But is there any such bipartisan support for impeaching President Bush?
It could happen because when the people, if you look at the polls now, it's astonishing. The polls show that the American people, the majority, are open to impeachment, more than open, favor it. And if you compare that to the impeachment of Bill Clinton, the numbers are staggering. It's like 26% were in favor of impeaching Bill Clinton, and 51 now
51%. Well, let me get David Swanson here. David,
Bush.
You're not going to have support from the Congress. You have Nancy Pelosi saying it's not on the agenda, it's not going to happen, even though they've been accused by conservatives of wanting to do that now that they're in power. They've said that's not what we're going to do.
Well, as Congresswoman Holtzman said, you know, we're not organizing this movement on behalf of a party. We're organizing it on behalf of our democracy and our Constitution. And if we go into the next presidency not having held this president accountable for lying us into a war, spying without warrants, detaining without charge, torturing, murdering, reversing laws with signing statements, then you're likely to have Hillary or Barack Obama reading your private emails. I mean, this is not about politics.
David,
this is about the rule of law.
David, stop it. This is all about politics, and it's disgraceful. Liz Holtzman, there is a bill put forward by John Conyers, H.R. 635, calling for an investigation into the impeachment of the president. This is all about politics. You don't like the president's policies, you want to attack him, and you want to do politically what you guys couldn't accomplish at the ballot box in 04. That's what this is about.
It won't work that way. If the American people think that this is to undo an election, that this is political revenge, that this is retribution, it'll never happen.
But it is. This is what it all is.
Look, go back to Watergate. It wasn't about that. In fact, just remember, when we took our first vote on the impeachment, it was so sober and so sad, whether we were Democrats or Republicans or liberals or conservatives. Peter Rodino, who was the chair of the committee, went back after that vote. He was a liberal Democrat, and he cried. He cried because we're talking about
David.
As David Swanson said, we're talking about preserving the democracy.
No, you're not.
Yes, we are, because the Constitution is the critical thing.
You guys have called the president every name in the book, and you know what, David? It's disgraceful. And you know what? You're not going to be successful, but you don't care because you put your own personal political agenda above what's in the best interest of the country. Because you don't like the fact that you lost. That's just pure and simple. It's transparent.
You know, the people who wrote our Constitution knew that we would have elections. They wanted us to have elections. They also put impeachment in there 6 places as the central means by which we can hold a president accountable who gets out of control.
Well, I'm very pleased to introduce peace activist David Swanson. David, thank you for being here with us today, and thank you for all your incredible work. After researching your vision and things you've worked on, I saw many parallels with mine. I've also been an activist for impeaching Bush and Cheney and a huge Kucinich supporter, and I'm also very much focused on war and peace activism. And I also see war as so fundamental to every other issue. But first, I'd like to start out with a question about your efforts on impeachment. We just played a clip from a Fox News interview with you regarding Bush impeachment. Could you tell us a little bit about your work with after Downing Street and that impeachment campaign?
Sure, and we can talk about Obama and Trump and worthy of impeachment if you want.
That was the follow-up, yeah.
Okay. Well, May 2005, we put together a campaign called After Downing Street because this document, Downing Street Minutes or the Downing Street Memo, had come out in the British media and had very quickly picked up by media around the globe, but was just shunned by news media outlets. And we wanted to make it known because this was minutes of a meeting of the cabinet and Downing Street, the Prime Minister, and their top intelligence official coming back from Washington after just met with Bush's top intelligence official, CIA Director, and reporting that, hey, Americans are going to lie about reasons for the war. They're going to want what? Ready for war. And this was, months after this, we had Bush and Blair pretending they were to avoid war, and pretending they were forced into war by the Syrians. Substantial evidence, and so this very authoritative document came out of Downing Street. So we started pushing Congressman John Conyers and other representatives to build a case of impeachment and to end the wars. This was, recall, when the Democrats were in the minority in both houses, and they were pretending to give a damn about it. They were pretending they would try to end the wars.
Right.
They would try to impeach Bush or Cheney, and they got the majorities largely on that message in the election of 2006. And said to hell with it. In fact, Rahm Emanuel was in charge of the House of Representatives, told Washington Post in January of 2007, we're going to keep the war in Iraq going so we can be against it again in 2 years and run against it again. So
One interesting thing I saw in the clip was you warned almost prophetically that if we didn't hold these leaders accountable, that Obama or Hillary or the following presidents would could continue infringing on civil liberties, and it seems like that's what we were shown with Snowden, and now we have Trump to build on that whole record of unaccountability. I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, partisanship is so toxic in Washington, D.C. that, not only do people get played by partisanship as the peace movement, the impeachment movement did, then you have this notion that you can just trace one bad official, one from the other party, things will improve. Accusations of partisanship being behind everything when anyone legitimate the position shows up. So we kept saying years and years, we want to impeach Bush and Cheney not because they're Republicans. We would want them if they were Democrats or statehood or anything else. but because if you don't impeach them, you have precedent, you have it expanded upon and solidified by future presidents. And had Obama come with the Democrats, they said, don't impeach, go elections. And what happens? Torture is made a policy choice, not a crime. Lawless impeachment is codified and made policy. Warrantless indictment is made official, the acceptable, written, public, not secret policy of both parties, and therefore of the U.S. government. The wars are continued, the war powers are continued and expanded. The signing documents, legislated by linking signature, it's made official policy of both parties. So, all of them, I can go through,
Right.
we don't have time. They're all made firm and established and then expanded upon in many cases by Donald Trump.
So I was reading some of your books here, and I was really interested in the outlawry movement and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Is there anything you could tell us about that? That was really interesting stuff that I never knew about.
Well, I can talk for many hours on that subject. You may want 30 seconds, but my book is called When the World Outlawed War, and it's about the peace movement of the 1920s and its creation of this treaty known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact that is still on the books and bans all war. It's interesting that a couple of law professors from Yale came out with a book about the same treaty this year. And these are supporters of current wars. These are people who don't have any interest in abolishing war and don't believe that the Kellogg-Briand Pact abolished war or was ever intended to. And yet, and I disagree fundamentally with many of their contentions, and yet they make an incredible case for the difference that the Kellogg-Briand Pact made. It ended colonization. It ended conquest of territory. It radically reduced dangers of war in the world. It reshaped international law, and of course, as was already well known, created the prosecutions for the first time of war as a crime following World War II, albeit only of the losers of that war. So 1928 is a sea change in international law and in understanding of war as a crime rather than simply a fun, benevolent human activity, which is what it was up through 1927.
Right. Well, I also recently just read your War is a Lie second edition. That book is quite precious. It's really moved me, and I was really amazed by all the information in there that I learned, and I can't recommend it enough to anyone. Everyone. But one thing that really struck me in there is that I'd heard Howard Zinn talk about the three holy wars, as he called them before. The Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and World War II. And I really liked the detail that you gave on those wars and how powerful the propaganda is from that. Is there anything you could say to help emphasize or elaborate on that, those war lies particularly being damaging to our understanding of reality?
Well, thank you for reading all of my books, and thank you for mentioning Howard Zinn. I think when you look at those first two, the Revolution and the Civil War, which is what people call them, as if there were only one of each of those in the world, they're really viewed as if the rest of the world doesn't exist. Right? I mean, when people talk about the merits of the American Revolution, there's never any discussion of how Canada or Australia or anywhere else is worse off for not having had a violent revolution against Britain. What did the U.S. gain that these other countries didn't gain? This ought to be the starting place for justifying such a war, and instead it's completely missing. Then you have slavery which dominated the globe. As much as 3/4 of the world living in some form of slavery or serfdom, and within 100 years, virtually eliminated as legal practice and radically diminished in actual existence across the globe. This was a global movement that ended slavery and serfdom, and yet you have it talked about in U.S. history textbooks as if it were unique to the United States, and the way to end it was with a civil war. whereas virtually nowhere else did any civil war have anything to do with ending slavery. And so you have to start with what would have been so bad? How would it have been worse to end slavery without a civil war? This ought to be the starting point. But these two wars are of virtually negligible importance in terms of U.S. war propaganda. World War II is it. World War II is the origin myth of U.S. militarist society.
Everybody talks about, comparing all these dictators to Hitler, and that justifies, going after them.
Right. There's a new Hitler every, 6 months or so, and has been for 75 years. And none of them has borne any resemblance to Hitler, and neither does the mythical Hitler bear much resemblance to the real Hitler, which is not to make the absurd and sick comment about Hitler not being a horrible, mongering mass murderer, which of course he was. The point is that, there's not one point. There's endless points to be made about World War II, and to justice to do it, we need to take hours now to discuss it. But the myths about World War II that are dominant in U.S. society are myths. The U.S., as Howard Zinn recounts so well, was out to dominate the globe and viewed an anti-Soviet policy as the way to do that until the Nazis began to cause too much trouble. And the Japanese, who had been trained in militarism and colonization by the Americans, began to cause too much trouble. And then there was a different policy needed, U.S. imperial expansion. And immediately, upon the end of World War II, it was back to anti-Soviet U.S. imperial policy. In fact, Winston Churchill, in hours of the end of World War II, proposed a new war on the Soviet Union with German troops. The mindset, the saving the Jews, saving the victims of the concentration camps with a war that killed 10 times as many people as died in the camp.
I thought some of the key lies that you exposed were specifically about Pearl Harbor and the fact that the U.S. interest in fighting Hitler wasn't necessarily about protecting the Jews or racism because of segregation and things like that. Could you tell us a little bit more about those lies specifically, like about Pearl Harbor? I mean, the U.S. provoked that.
Yes, indeed. Franklin Roosevelt wanted to get into the war. Franklin Roosevelt had committed to Winston Churchill to get into the war. This was the substance of another Downing Street minutes, of another Downing Street meeting. Everything possible was to be done to provoke an incident with Japan. This after Roosevelt had, pushed the program of lending war supplies to the British and quietly, non-publicly assisting the British with the war and telling lies about sunken ships, just as Woodrow Wilson did leading up to World War I, as if the ship had not been part of the war in each case.
The Lusitania was armed, it had arms on it.
Arms and troops on the way to war, known to the Germans and others at the time, and public warnings issued, do not sail on this ship. And the captain, the former captain, wouldn't sail on the ship because was going into what the Germans called a war zone. This is the work we've moved on to World War I now with the Lusitania. But again, Winston Churchill, who at that time was in charge of the usual protection that was given to such ships, and didn't give it to Lusitania, although the company was counting on it. And the Lusitania became a case for getting the Americans into World War I, and largely what the Secretary of State of the United States resigned over, because the United States was not staying neutral. Some of the same lies came up in World War II.
One key lie that you helped me understand was that the U.S. was really aggressively pushing its military bases and war games further and further towards Japan, and that was a provocation that I hadn't fully comprehended, and that Hawaii at the time wasn't even a state.
Hawaii was a territory that had been stolen decades earlier, but the United States had expanded its military into Hawaii and into the Aleutian Islands and into Guam and the Marianas and Southeast Asia, and building up a Pacific force that Japan was warning was unacceptable to Japan. This decades after the United States had militarized Japan and trained up Japan as a junior partner in empire and told Japan it should have Monroe Doctrine for Asia and that be, sort of honorary Caucasians, as they in fact called it, Aryans. But Japan committed an act of mass murder at Pearl Harbor, and you have to sort of state these obvious things, that there's nothing acceptable about Japan murdering people at Pearl Harbor, to then go on and add that this was provoked. This was interpreted by one of the judges at the War Crimes Tribunal in Tokyo after the war as having been provocation. And it was knowing. Franklin Roosevelt's prediction of a Japanese attack was off by 6 days. It wasn't off by years. It wasn't non-existent. In fact, numerous steps were taken intentionally, including cutting off scrap metal, cutting off oil to Japan to provoke an attack.
Right, and it just, if you talk about becoming resistant to these lies, and if you apply that lie to our modern example of our war games on the borders of North Korea, or we have war games on the border of Russia that most people don't hear about. I just think that that's a really relevant kind of point.
I agree. This is why I think it's important for us to learn about lies that started previous wars. And it's very important to war-making governments to hide those lies. The U.S. government is putting millions and millions of dollars to beautifying the war on Vietnam now, when there's no U.S. war in Vietnam, because it understands the importance of not knowing the truth of what that was about, how propaganda was used to get it started and escalate it and continue it, because people might learn lessons and they might question the assertion that North Korea is a threat to the United States, and the United States need to be a bigger threat to North Korea.
Right. One last point about World War II before we move on is I was really struck by how you detailed in War is a Lie that Hitler at first wasn't going to kill all the Jews, and he actually was going to try to kick them out of the country or whatever, but in the United States and Britain, and to some degree, prevented them from escaping, and then that ultimately, was followed by genocide.
Well, through the 30s and early 40s, it was increasingly known what the Nazis were up to, and they were imposing all sorts of unfair policies on Jews, but they wanted to export all the Jews, and they wanted to find somewhere in the world that would take them. And there were meetings of not just the U.S. and Britain, but numerous countries that all agreed not to take them, and U.S. immigration policy was not to accept refugee children. I mean, a ship of Jewish refugees was chased away from Miami by the Coast Guard. Anne Frank, you read Dick Cheney's book about U.S. exceptionalism and we need more wars, and you'll find Anne Frank just in every case for war. Anne Frank, but her family's visa application was turned down by the U.S. State Department. And in the early years of the war and into the war, it was peace activists who were going to the U.S. and British governments and saying, make a deal with Hitler, bring the Jews out, or they're going to be killed, while it was still possible to bring them out. And what Churchill said, and what Anthony Eden, his foreign secretary, said, and this was after Dunkirk, this was after the British had pulled hundreds of thousands of their own troops out, was, we can't be bothered. We don't have to transport. We don't have the vehicles to do it. When they had thousands of US airplanes and so forth, they just had they had zero interest in rescuing anybody from what became the chief propaganda for the war after the war, once the war was ended.
Right. Another part of your book I really liked was a section that specifically talked about the impacts on women and children of war and sexual assault, and there was a horrific, testimony in there by a soldier that was involved in a sexual assault in the Middle East wars. And I think about this growing Me Too movement where women are coming out about sexual assault, and for some reason I read that and I was thinking, these women are voiceless, and I thought I wanted to create a hashtag them too, that we should be concerned about all the massive sexual assault that happens in war, and that that's kind of the ideal situation for someone that wants to engage in that kind of behavior and get away with it. There's no accountability. I didn't know if you could add to that.
Well, I think it's important to realize that, most of the damage done in war is done by bombs and other major weapons, and 2/3 of those victims are women and children. War is not something that happens on a battlefield between teams of soldiers. It happens in villages and towns and cities. But of course, sexual assault is a big part of many wars as a weapon against an enemy. And as a weapon against fellow soldiers within a military. Within the U.S. military, female members of that military are, very heavily sexually harassed and assaulted and raped. And the term for much of it is command rape, meaning being raped by someone who has command over you, which is, the ultimate sort of sexual harassment, which, to its credit, U.S. society has started to move against. And yet we have a society that talks about imposing the draft, the selective service on women as equal rights, the equal right to be forced against your will to go to war, letting women participate fully in wars as, somehow good progressive policy, and bombing men, women, and children for women's rights in places like Afghanistan, where, by the way, that doesn't.
Right. Another point, I guess, is that I learned here is that, I wasn't fully aware that, I knew that lots of civilians have been killed in World War II, but I wasn't really aware that that was kind of the war. After that, all sides kind of bombed cities full of civilians, and it was kind of a turning point to where afterwards more civilians died than soldiers. And I saw the percentages you listed in there that, larger percentages died in Korea and Vietnam War and so forth. Could you add to that kind of point?
Well, it used to be the case, even in World War I and certainly in earlier wars, that most of the dying was done by soldiers on battlefields or having left battlefields. Of course, when disease epidemics were created, like the flu out of World War I, that killed thousands of people who had nothing to do with the war. But the war victims of the war itself tended to be soldiers. World War II was a turning point because it became a standard practice to bomb cities and to try to kill as many civilians as possible. I mean, this had happened on a very small scale in World War I. The British had done it in places where nobody counts as a human being and nobody cares, like Iraq and South Africa and India. But when the Germans started bombing Europeans in Spain and in Poland, and when the British and the Germans began bombing each other, and the British were as much a part of starting that as the Germans were, although they, switched the dates around to blame the Germans for starting it, and the United States got in on a scale never before seen, and took that same tactic to Asia, where the Japanese had already been bombing the Chinese civilians. This is how World War II became the single worst thing by far humanity has ever done to itself in any short space of time, and killing civilians became.
It just seems to me that, if all sides are bombing cities full of civilians, there is no good side or good guys or good war, that everyone's kind of equally, or every side, rather, is equally engaging in evil practices.
I certainly think so. I mean, even without air wars, even without certain weapons, I would say the very same thing, but it's worse with weapons that kill more people. And this is what air war is. It's something that was seen as a crime by everyone right at the start and partway into World War II. And you had Franklin Roosevelt asking all sides to commit to the standard legal practice of not bombing cities. And Hitler included, they all said, yes, we agree. We would never do such a thing. But as each side did a little bit more of it, and blamed the other and escalated, it became standard practice. So that now, last year, 2016, you had a Republican presidential primary debate where the moderator on U.S. television asked, would you be willing to kill hundreds and thousands of innocent children, as part of your basic presidential duties? And there was no scandal over that question. It was just a question in a debate.
Right. I heard a poll from, I think it was Stanford, I think, did a poll where it was kind of alarming a little bit. They said that a majority of Americans would support bombing Iran with nuclear weapons and killing 2 million people if that meant that 20,000 American troops would be saved. And I think they were trying to make the analogy between Hiroshima, that would you accept doing that? I was really appalled to think that a majority of Americans would support nuking 2 million people for any reason.
Yeah, I've seen similar polling where the question was about North Koreans. How many million North Koreans end up being worth one U.S. life? And this is the thing. It's not that people want to kill men, women, and children. It's not that they're all sadists. I mean, the general public in the United States, there certainly is a collection of sadists in Washington, D.C. But what drives U.S. policy, with an incredible passion, is the need for the U.S. to be distinct and unique and exceptional. I watched a Republican presidential primary debate back in 2012 where Ron Paul, the Libertarian candidate, spoke against wars and got cheers. Some of the other candidates spoke in favor of wars and got cheers. But when Ron Paul said, what if we treated other countries like this country and applied the golden rule to foreign policy, treat other countries as we'd like this country to be treated, they booed him. They booed a Republican in South Carolina for quoting Jesus at them because he was suggesting that other countries should be valued at the same level as the United States. And that is the most unacceptable proposal in U.S. politics.
Okay, I wanted to get your thoughts on a couple other things too. With this, Trump is moving the capital of Israel to Jerusalem, and that's causing a big uproar. Most of the international community seems to be condemning that. I'm just interested in what you think about that and the implications.
Well, it's something that's been backed by Congress for years, but then a waiver being used by presidents if they saw it as a danger, and they all quite sensibly did up until now, where they still see it as a danger. And the U.S. State Department has issued warnings to all personnel, and there's already been a possibly related attempted suicide attack in New York City. There were the day of the announcement, immediate protests in over a dozen countries across the Middle East. It seems like an attempt to create a provocation for war, to announce that the capital of Israel is Jerusalem and the U.S. Embassy will go there, is to announce, here's a target, attack it, and we'll create a war. And this is openly what many supporters of the policy want. If you watch this Trump rally in Pensacola, Florida, with a Florida state senator saying, by doing this, Trump is bringing Jesus back. And by bringing Jesus back, he means destroying the world. And by destroying the world, he means that to be a good thing. We want the world destroyed in order to live in a better, magical place with Jesus. This is the goal, right? And this is something the vice president may believe. This is something the head of the CIA talks about believing. And they're talking about moving him to the Pentagon and putting another guy who seems to believe this madness to the CIA, and Senator Tom Cotton. This ought to be the biggest story. Yeah. That a big chunk of the U.S. public that's getting represented in Washington, like the rest of us aren't, wants to destroy the world to fulfill a mythical prophecy of thousands of years ago. How is that not that or climate change? These are the rivals for what ought to be the biggest story in U.S. media.
Right. Now, if I could play a quick video relating to the move of the capital of Israel to Jerusalem. The leader of Turkey got into somewhat of a war of words with Prime Minister Netanyahu over that, accusing Israel of slaughtering civilians and Netanyahu countered back that Turkey does as well.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has pledged to fight to reverse the United States' recognition of Jerusalem as the Israeli capital. Erdogan has called a summit of Islamic countries in Istanbul this Wednesday. In a speech in central Turkey, he lashed out against Israel. Israel is a terrorist state. We won't leave Jerusalem to the mercy of a child-murdering country. We won't leave Jerusalem to the mercy of a state that has no value other than occupation and plunder. We will continue our struggle within the law and democracy with determination. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is currently in Europe. He met with French President Emmanuel Macron ahead of talks with EU foreign ministers in Brussels on Monday. Asked about Erdogan's harsh words, Netanyahu fired back.
I'm not used to receiving lectures about morality from a leader who bombs Kurdish villagers in his native Turkey, who jails journalists, who helps Iran go around international sanctions, and who helps terrorists, including in Gaza, kill innocent people. That is not the man who is going to lecture us.
Demonstrations have been held across Turkey and the Middle East since Donald Trump's declaration on Jerusalem. An estimated 10,000 people rallied on Sunday in Istanbul to protest the move.
I was surprised, really, to see another major head of state criticizing Israel so harshly, talking about them massacring children, and they kind of fought back and forth. I wonder, though, if this move to move the capital to Jerusalem could unify a lot of the rest of the world and isolate the U.S. and Israel in terms of these kinds of issues, and what could be the implications of that.
I certainly think that is the case, and you know, the implications could be good or bad, depending in part on whether they're violent or nonviolent. But certainly, the U.S. and Israel are isolated at the United Nations, and the approach of the United Nations and even of the International Criminal Court, as well as bodies like UNESCO, I mean, just leave the United States out as the rogue state that it has chosen to be. You know, whether this changes U.S. policy is really the big question, because it's the U.S. that's giving Israel billions of dollars of weapons every year. And until that stops, Israeli behavior is not going to stop, is not going to change. You know, the other door that's opened in recent weeks is this story of Mike Flynn lying to the FBI and being convicted of lying to the FBI. And, you know, people think what he did wrong was talk to someone who's Russian. What he did wrong was talk to someone who's Russian about working on behalf of the Israeli government to subvert U.S. policy at the United Nations and try to stop a resolution on illegal settlements at the United Nations, because then President Obama had chosen not to veto it. You know, if this becomes a problem for the rest of the world, if this becomes an issue in a Trump impeachment, that could open doors to better results in Israel. We'll see.
Right. And speaking of Russia, one issue that seems to be a key war lie that we're kind of told is lies about relating to Russia in terms of the Ukrainian coup and you know, NATO expanding its bases and war games closer and closer to the borders of Russia. Could you tell us anything about that?
Well, the lie in U.S. media that really isn't even known to people I talk to in Russia about it. They've never heard it, and their jaws drop when they hear it. The lie is that there wasn't any coup, that the U.S. had nothing to do with it, that in fact there was a legitimate change of government followed by a Russian invasion. of Ukraine. And in fact, Russia has given military support to groups in Ukraine, and I've opposed that. Russia has a military base in Crimea and always did, and had troops there and sent more troops there, and I opposed that. But the fact is that the U.S. openly, indisputably facilitated a coup, an anti-Russian coup, an anti-Russian Ukrainian coup, threats to the people of Crimea, who voted overwhelmingly to rejoin Russia and have never been asked to re-vote because the outcome would be the same. So I saw a website called PolitiFact just today, I think, named the lie of the year as the lie by Donald Trump that he and Russia didn't steal the U.S. election, right? And PolitiFact justified this by saying reports from the 17 intelligence agencies show that Vladimir Putin ordered the stealing. Well, no report ever showed any such thing, and no report ever came from the 17 intelligence agencies. This evidence-free report came from a couple of these 17 intelligence agencies. I nominate PolitiFact's lie about the lie of the year as the lie of the year.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up. We just got a couple more questions. I just want to say first that you're a huge inspiration to me, and I see a lot of parallels with how you see the world and myself. And I've done a lot of research about a lot of peace heroes in the last century, and some of the people I really look up to are the people that fought to get rid of nuclear weapons. Einstein, Schweitzer, Bertrand Russell, Joseph Rotblat. And one thing, Eric Fromm, a psychologist I also appreciate, he said that one thing that defined all those people was a love of life, or he calls it biophilia, and their faith in the power of reason. And I just wanted to say that that's what struck me when I read your book, War is a Lie, is that just you have an amazing power of reason, and it's really inspiring. And I just want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I very much appreciate it. And I'm working with a lot of people at World Beyond War who have given me inspiration and ideas. And we've, sort of created an organization where we come up with better ideas together. And I hope you and others and your viewers will work with us at World Beyond War.
Yeah, that's one of my last questions. Is I wanted to see if you could tell us a little bit about the projects you're working on. I know you work with World Beyond War and also Roots Action. Are there certain other projects that we should be aware of?
Well, Roots Action is one of my jobs that's numerous issues, including anti-war. But World Beyond War, which is at worldbeyondwar.org, is exclusively working on the abolition of war, on education, on what we've been doing right here, talking about myths and truths about war. And organizing nonviolent activism against war. And we're working on campaigns around local resolutions, campaigns around divestment from weapons dealers, campaigns working with others abroad to close foreign military bases, which are virtually all U.S. foreign military bases, and working to uphold the rule of law and strengthen the rule of law around war. Numerous approaches. So anything you or anyone wants to work on, we're happy to work with them on that angle, on that area of ending all war.
Okay, well, I think that wraps it up. And thank you so much, David Swanson, for talking with us. It's been a pleasure, and I really want to tell you thank you for all your hard work and dedication. It really means a lot.
No problem. Thanks.
We also want to thank our viewers of World Citizen Wire. Please join us next time, where we should have more interesting guests for you. And may peace prevail.
Yeah, it's true, mankind must work, but that work can have a purpose. We can set upon the daunting task of fixing what is broken. We'll rewire the world with power grids that don't destroy the earth, bringing an end to war and hunger, and pay workers what they're worth. And the awesome power of doing good will be loosed upon the world, touching every man and woman, touching every boy and girl. And there won't be need for songs that paint the failure of mankind, cause a new song will be ringing in the freedom of our mind. Cause it doesn't have to be that way. We'll just wave a wand and move beyond the ancient endless cycle that has proved a dismal failure over and 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 it doesn't have to be this way. No, it doesn't have to be this way.